You ever have that feeling that history doesn't quite line up? Like when you look at old photos or read about an event and think, something's off here. Maybe it's not wrong, but it's like someone erased a few lines in the story before handing it to us. That's what this video is about. Not the textbook version of history, but the gaps between the lines. The moments that make you wonder if reality is a little more flexible than we were taught. We're going to talk about 5 theories tonight, 5 moments where the world might have slipped sideways, where logic doesn't completely hold up, and where governments, scientists, and time itself start to feel like unreliable narrators. You've probably heard of big names like Roswell or MKUltra, but that's not what we're doing here. These are the stranger, quieter ones, the kind of mysteries that never made it into the mainstream, the ones people only talk about on late-night forums or in faded declassified files that barely anyone's read. And we're not just listing them. I want you to feel the atmosphere, because behind every theory is a real event, a ship vanishing from radar, 9 bodies found in the snow, radio signals cut off mid-sentence. It's not about whether you believe it. It's about understanding how thin the line is between what we call history and what might actually have happened. So before we start, take a second to think about this. How much of what you know is something you've experienced, and how much is something someone else told you? We trust books, governments, even photos, but every one of those can be edited. History isn't just what happened, it's what survived. Let's start from the beginning, or maybe a distortion of it, because our first story isn't about ghosts or lost civilizations. It's about a ship, a war, and a military experiment that, if even halfway true, changed the laws of physics. Imagine this. It's 1943, and the world is burning. World War II isn't just about guns and soldiers, it's about science. Whoever can twist reality first wins. Deep in a naval shipyard in Philadelphia, the US Navy is said to be testing something that could make ships completely invisible to radar, maybe even to the human eye. A technology so far ahead of its time, it sounds like it belongs in a science fiction novel. Except, the story goes, they actually tried it. And the result? Not what anyone expected. Some say the ship disappeared entirely, just blinked out of existence. Others say it teleported hundreds of miles away before reappearing in the harbour, its metal hull fused with the bodies of the crew. A handful of witnesses claim to see men walking through walls or vanishing into thin air. And the US Navy? They've denied it for decades. Now, that sounds like urban legend, right? But here's where it gets weird. Years later, classified naval files from the same period mention electromagnetic field manipulation experiments. Not invisibility, but not entirely unrelated either. And when you start connecting that to what was happening in physics at the time, Einstein's unified field theory, government interest in magnetism and relativity, it starts to sound less like fantasy and more like something someone could have tried, even if it went horribly wrong. That's what we'll explore first, the Philadelphia experiment. Not as a myth, but as a question. What happens when humans push the edge of science just a little too far and reality pushes back? But that's just one story. And the deeper we go, the more you'll notice a pattern. People disappearing, timelines not adding up, strange coincidences between unrelated events. It's almost like there's a shadow history running parallel to the one we were taught. By the end of this series, I want you to have one question in your mind. Not, are these theories true? But, what if history itself can glitch? Because that's the beauty and terror of all of this. These aren't ghost stories. They're human stories about fear, ambition, and the consequences of chasing something you don't fully understand. So, keep the lights low, grab your headphones, and settle in. We're about to trace the outline of 5 forgotten mysteries. And if you start to feel like reality's bending just a bit, don't worry. That's how it's supposed to feel. Next up, 1943. The ship that shouldn't have disappeared. The Philadelphia experiment. So, let's rewind. Philadelphia, 1943. The US is deep in World War II, and paranoia is at its peak. German U-boats stalk the Atlantic, sinking Allied ships faster than the Navy can replace them. Radar is still primitive. Submarines vanish beneath the waves, and the Allies need a miracle. According to legend, that miracle came from a classified project called Project Rainbow, a supposed attempt to make Navy ships invisible to enemy radar. On paper, it sounded scientific. Use electromagnetic fields to bend light around an object, rendering it effectively cloaked. In practice, it became something else. The story centers on a ship called the USS Eldridge, a 1,240-ton destroyer escort, freshly built in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The plan, allegedly, was to install a series of massive generators and coils designed to distort the ship's magnetic signature. The idea wasn't to make it disappear to the human eye, at least not at first, but to scramble radar detection. But then, according to witnesses, something went very wrong. In late October of 1943, the generators were activated. Witnesses claimed the air around the Eldridge shimmered, like heat rising off asphalt. Then a greenish-blue fog engulfed the ship. The outline of the vessel began to blur, and within moments, it was gone. Completely gone. Dock workers reportedly stood stunned. A few claimed they saw a faint ripple like the space where the ship had been was bending, and then, as suddenly as it had vanished, the ship reappeared. But this time, the celebration turned to horror. The crew, those who hadn't vanished entirely, were said to be in shock. Some were burned, some were disoriented, and in the most disturbing accounts, a few sailors were fused into the metal of the ship's hull, like they'd become part of it. One man's hand sticking through the steel, another's torso embedded in the deck. Others were said to have simply disappeared, gone without a trace. Now, if that sounds like science fiction, yeah, it does, and that's part of why this story lives on, because no official record of the event exists. The Navy denies anything like it ever took place, but the first public mention came in the 1950s, through a series of letters sent to a UFO researcher named Morris Jessup. The letters came from a man calling himself Carlos Allende, who claimed to have been an eyewitness aboard a nearby ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth. He described the Eldridge's disappearance, the eerie light, the men vanishing into thin air. He said he'd seen the impossible, a warship teleport hundreds of miles in seconds. Jessup didn't know what to make of it. But soon, strange things began happening. He was visited by men who identified themselves as government officials, who supposedly had a copy of his book, The Case for the UFO, filled with handwritten notes in the margins referencing Project Rainbow, unified field theory, and something called electromagnetic displacement. Those notes, whoever wrote them, hinted that Einstein's long-rumoured unified field theory, the idea that electromagnetism and gravity could be merged, had been secretly completed and weaponized. Now, here's where it gets unsettling. Years later, real documents did confirm that the Navy conducted magnetic degaussing experiments during World War II, designed to make ships less detectable by magnetic mines. And those experiments did involve wrapping ships in heavy electromagnetic cables and generating powerful fields. So, a kernel of truth existed. But the leap from degaussing to teleportation, that's the mystery. And then there's the human side. Survivors, if you believe the accounts, weren't the same afterward. Allende wrote that some sailors would fade out, becoming invisible for short bursts, or walk through solid objects by accident. A few were said to have gone insane, muttering about the other place they saw while the ship was gone. The legend even claims one sailor was found years later in a bar fight. He lost his temper, and in front of witnesses he blinked out of existence. Of course, skeptics have tried to debunk the whole thing. The Eldridge's logs show it was never in Philadelphia that day. Official records place it in New York Harbor. The Navy called the entire story a misunderstanding of routine experiments. But even that explanation raises questions. Why were so many details in Allende's letters later found to reference real classified programs? How did he know about the degaussing cables before the Navy admitted to using them? And maybe the bigger question, why does this story refuse to die? It's been almost 80 years, and it still surfaces in documentaries, forums, and conspiracy boards. Not because people think the ship literally teleported, but because deep down, The Philadelphia experiment feels like a metaphor. It's about human curiosity, our obsession with pushing limits. What if the government really did try something beyond their understanding? What if they succeeded for just a second, enough to see what wasn't meant to be seen, and then covered it up before anyone could grasp what happened? Maybe it wasn't invisibility or teleportation. Maybe it was something else entirely, a moment when science accidentally brushed against whatever it is that keeps our world stitched together. The Philadelphia experiment didn't end in the harbor. It ended in a mind. Specifically, the mind of Morris K. Jessup. Remember him? The UFO researcher who received those strange, rambling letters from a man calling himself Carlos Allende. Jessup wasn't some crackpot theorist. He had a master's degree in astrophysics and wrote serious works about the possibility of interstellar travel. But once he started digging into the Eldridge story, his life started to unravel. He tried to ignore it at first. A letter from some guy claiming the Navy had bent time and space. Sounds like a hoax, but Allende's letters kept coming. Dozens of them, pages filled with scrawled handwriting, diagrams, cryptic notes about men fading in the walls, and field resonances misaligned with the human frame. The more Jessup read, the less he slept. Then, in 1957, something strange happened. Jessup was contacted by the Office of Naval Research. They claimed they'd received an annotated copy of his book, The Case for the UFO, filled with comments written in 3 distinct handwritings, supposedly discussing alien technology, secret government tests, and Project Rainbow. The notes referenced Allende directly, his same phrases, his same bizarre obsession with unified fields and magnetic resonance. The ONR asked Jessup to come in. They wanted his opinion. Imagine that for a second. You write a speculative book, get letters from a guy claiming to have seen a teleporting ship, and suddenly the US Navy invites you to discuss handwritten notes about your own book. That's not a normal day. The Navy even printed a limited number of copies of that annotated version, known today as the Varro edition. Only a few survive, but those who've read it say it's one of the strangest documents ever produced by the US government. It reads like a conversation between 3 beings, Mr. A, Mr. B, and Jemmy, discussing how humans accidentally stumbled into higher dimensional technology. Now, skeptics will tell you it's nonsense, a prank, some elaborate hoax that Jessup got too wrapped up in. But what makes it haunting isn't the content, it's what happened next. In 1959, 2 years after his meeting with the Navy, Morris Jessup was found dead in his car. The official ruling: suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. But here's the thing, his friends said he'd been in good spirits. He'd just arranged to meet one of them that same evening to discuss a breakthrough. And the location of his death? A quiet park, not far from where he'd been conducting private research into magnetic anomalies. No note was found, no clear motive, just silence. After Jessup's death, the Philadelphia experiment took on a new life. It became one of those stories that lives in the space between rumor and reality, too persistent to dismiss, too absurd to believe. People began connecting it to other strange wartime experiments, like Project Montauk, an alleged series of time travel tests on Long Island decades later. The claim was that the Montauk experiments were an extension of the same technology tested on the Eldridge. In other words, the experiment didn't fail, it just went underground. What's fascinating is how the myth grew despite the Navy's total denial. You'd think a clear, consistent debunking would kill a conspiracy, but instead, every denial seemed to add fuel. Every time someone said, "That's impossible," a new detail emerged, another document, another sighting, another declassified photo of the Eldridge bathed in green light. And if you dig into online archives, you'll find something else. A repeating theme in all these accounts: silence, witnesses disappearing, letters lost, government offices claiming files were misplaced. It's the quiet parts of history that make the loudest noise. Now, maybe the whole thing was a myth, an urban legend born from post-war paranoia and bad memory. But myths don't survive this long without a heartbeat. Something about the Philadelphia experiment feels symbolic, like a warning about what happens when technology outruns morality. Because even if it never happened, it could have. The science wasn't far-fetched for its time. Tesla's coil experiments, Einstein's unified field theory. the Navy's obsession with radar cloaking. The ingredients were all there. And maybe that's why this story sticks, because whether or not the Eldridge vanished, the idea that humans might have torn a hole in reality for the sake of war, that idea never went away. By the end of the 20th century, new stories began surfacing. Declassified files hinted at Soviet experiments in electromagnetic propulsion. Witnesses described bizarre radiation tests, and soon, you step outside in winter, but the kind that bites through your bones and hums in your ears. It's February 1959, deep in the Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia. A group of 9 young hikers sets out on a journey they'll never return from. They were all experienced, strong, smart, the kind of people who thrived in the wilderness. Led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, the group included students, athletes, and survivalists from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Their goal was simple: reach a mountain pass north of the region known as Archaeological, which in the local Mansi language means Mountain of the Dead. But of course, they didn't know that when they set out. Their trek started normal. Photographs recovered later showed smiles, snowball fights, and laughter. But as the days went on, the weather turned violent. Visibility dropped. Temperatures fell below -30 degrees Celsius. They were forced off their route and made camp on the slope of Archaeological itself. That's where everything went wrong. On the night of February 1st, something happened inside that tent. Something that caused all 9 hikers to cut their way out from the inside and flee half-dressed into the snow. No shoes, no coats, some barefoot, some wearing only socks, in temperatures that would freeze skin in minutes. Their bodies were found weeks later, scattered across the snow in strange positions, some near the remains of a fire, others half buried in the drift. 2 of them had crushed skulls. 2 had broken ribs, but no external bruising. One woman, Lyudmila Dubanina, was missing her tongue and eyes, and here's where the mystery really deepens. Radiation was detected on their clothing. Not enough to kill, but far beyond what should have been there. The official Soviet investigation was quick and vague. Their conclusion: a compelling natural force. That's all. No cause, no further explanation. Just a force. And when you say something like that, you leave space for every theory imaginable. Some said it was an avalanche, but the terrain didn't fit. The tent was still mostly upright, and the footprints in the snow were calm, orderly. Others blamed infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that can induce panic or disorientation. There's even a theory that the Soviet military was secretly testing parachute mines, silent, drifting explosives that could explain the strange injuries and the bright orbs reportedly seen in the sky that night by witnesses miles away. Then there are the stranger ones: alien encounter, secret weapons test, or something older, something connected to the land itself. The local Mansi people avoided that mountain, calling it cursed. They said it was a place where spirits walked during storms, a spot where even hunters refused to camp. But here's the detail that haunts most people: the way they ran. The tent was sliced open from the inside, which means they weren't attacked from outside. They were trying to get out. Something terrified them enough to abandon warmth and safety and run into a frozen death. And it happened in seconds. Their cameras, recovered later, showed nothing obvious, just normal photos of snow and camp life. But one final photo, the last frame on the last roll, shows a blurred light glowing against the darkness of the trees. It's impossible to tell what it is, but it's enough to make you wonder. Years later, one of the rescue team members claimed the hiker's skin looked oddly tanned, as if they'd been exposed to radiation or high-intensity light. Others described a faint metallic smell around the bodies, a smell they couldn't place. And then there's the file itself, the case documents, buried in archives for decades. When they were finally declassified, some pages were missing. Others were censored with black bars. Photographs were cropped, captions removed. Even the location where the bodies were found was listed under a different name, Dyatlov Pass, a title created after the incident. Not what? And so, over the years, the Dyatlov Pass incident became a mirror. Everyone who looked into it saw their own version of the truth. For some, it was human error, a chain of bad luck in brutal weather. For others, it was the shadow of the Cold War, a test gone wrong, a cover-up too dangerous to reveal. And for a few, it was something deeper, because what kind of force makes 9 experienced hikers calmly walk into the night to freeze to death and never try to come back? No one has ever answered that. But maybe the truth lies in what came next, the second investigation, decades later, when modern researchers returned to the pass and discovered something that even the skeptics couldn't explain. Something that suggested the mountain might not be done keeping its secrets. Decades passed. The Ural Mountains stayed silent, snow covering whatever secrets the wind had buried that night. For a while, the Dyatlov Pass incident was just a ghost story told in hushed tones around campfires or whispered in the corners of old Soviet dormitories. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. Files opened, memories resurfaced. And what came out wasn't closure, it was confusion. In the early 1990s, Russian journalists began revisiting the case. They found fragments, missing pages, blurred photos, notes that didn't add up. The official reports mentioned a powerful natural force, but no one could say what that meant. And the deeper they dug, the more contradictions they found. For one, the injuries. Autopsies described blunt force trauma similar to that of a car crash, yet there were no external wounds. How do you shatter ribs and crush skulls without leaving bruises? Some investigators proposed a pressure wave, like the concussive blast from an explosion, but with no burn marks or shrapnel. Others pointed to military testing. At the time, the Soviet Union was experimenting with radiation-based weapons and aerial mines in remote regions, and Dyatlov's group had accidentally set up camp near one of those sites. The radiation found on their clothing could have been residue from those tests, and those mysterious orange orbs reported in the sky by locals that same night. Possibly parachute flares, or maybe something else entirely. Then, in 2013, something strange happened. A team of independent researchers hiked to the same site. They set up camp in the same area, using the same equipment, even building a tent modelled after Dyatlov's. During the night, they heard something. A low, humming vibration, almost below hearing range. The tent began to shake slightly, snow dislodging from the ridge above. The lead researcher described feeling a suffocating panic, for no reason. That's when the infrasound theory resurfaced. According to that idea, the unique shape of the mountain and the direction of the wind can create low-frequency sound waves that cause nausea, anxiety, and a feeling of impending doom. It wouldn't kill you, but it could drive you to make irrational decisions, like cutting your way out of a tent in a blind panic. It's elegant, scientific, almost comforting, but it doesn't explain the radiation, or the missing eyes and tongue, or why some of the hikers tried to climb a tree before dying. There's always one detail the theory can't quite fit. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the case again. Their conclusion, after months of modern analysis, was that a slab avalanche, a rare, delayed snowslide, hit the camp. They said the slope was just steep enough for a compact layer of snow to shift suddenly, crushing part of the tent and forcing the hikers to flee. They died of hypothermia trying to find shelter. And that's it. Case closed. Except it wasn't. The angle of the slope doesn't match avalanche conditions. No one could find the kind of damage expected from one, and eyewitnesses at the time said the tent was still standing when rescuers arrived. Even stranger, several hikers' watches had stopped at different times, suggesting whatever happened took place over hours, not minutes. It wasn't a single event. It was a sequence. To this day, no official explanation satisfies everyone, because the Dyatlov Pass incident isn't just a mystery, it's a feeling. A sense that something outside our understanding brushed against those 9 people in the snow and left without leaving a trace. Maybe it was nature, a rare convergence of wind, pressure, snow, and fear. Maybe it was human, secret tests gone wrong, and the government burying its mistake. Or maybe it was something else. Something ancient that never cared about our explanations in the first place. Every few years, new hikers visit the site. Some leave flowers, some leave compasses that spin strangely near the tent site. Others swear they hear faint voices carried on the wind, not words, just the echo of panic frozen in time. And that's the unsettling part. The Dyatlov Pass doesn't give answers. It gives silence, like the mountain itself is watching, waiting to see who asks the wrong question next. For now, all we have are fragments, 9 names carved into stone and 1 unsolved puzzle in the snow. But if the Dyatlov Pass shows us anything, it's that the line between explanation and mystery is thin, and every time we think we've found the truth, the mountain takes it back. Maybe that's why the case feels so alive even after all these years. Because somewhere out there, beneath the frost and silence, 9 ghosts are still running from something, and no one knows what. Next, we're leaving the mountains behind and heading upward, not into legend, but into orbit. Because in the early years of the space race, long before Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, there were whispers that he might not have been the first at all. They called them the lost cosmonauts. It begins with static, not the comforting kind, like an old TV left on too long. This was sharper, colder, almost alive. Late 1950s. The world is divided by an invisible curtain, the Cold War. Every country is building rockets, missiles, and machines that could reach the stars, or destroy the planet trying. But behind the banners and parades, another race was unfolding, the one to put the first human into space. Officially, the Soviets won. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit Earth. His smile was everywhere. Posters, newspapers, even stamps. But some people say Gagarin wasn't the first, because years before his flight, radio operators across Europe picked up strange transmissions, and what they heard didn't sound like victory. It sounded like a man dying. In 1957, just after Sputnik 1 launched, a pair of brothers in Italy, Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia, built a homemade radio station inside an abandoned German bunker near Turin. They called it Torre Bear. Armed with scavenged antennas and reel-to-reel recorders, they began tracking Soviet satellites. At first, they picked up beeps and static, nothing unusual. But then, they caught something different. A heartbeat, a human heartbeat, faint, steady, and coming from space. They recorded it. The world ignored it. But they didn't stop listening. Over the next few years, the brothers claimed to intercept several more transmissions. In one, a woman's voice could be heard speaking in Russian, panicked, gasping for breath. She said things like, "It's getting hot. I can see fire. I'm losing control." Then silence. The signal faded, never to return. They dated the recording to May 1961, just days before Gagarin's official flight. But the Soviets never reported any failed missions. No missing astronauts. According to them, nothing like that ever happened. So who was she? People began to call her the lost cosmonaut. The story spread through underground papers, whispers in bars, and crackling AM radios. Some said there were dozens like her, test pilots, prisoners, even soldiers, launched into space on early Vostok rockets, never meant to return. They were ghost flights, the failures erased from history. It fit the time perfectly. The Soviet Union was obsessed with secrecy. Success was broadcast to the world. Failure buried 6 feet deep. They had every reason to cover up a death in orbit. After all, what's one life compared to national pride? But then, skeptics started poking holes in the story. The frequencies didn't always match Soviet bands. The translations were rough. Some said the voices might have been distorted shortwave signals bouncing around the ionosphere, not actual transmissions from space. And the Giudica Cordiglia brothers? They were hobbyists, not professionals. But they never sought fame or money. They just kept recording, tape after tape, each one stranger than the last. One of the most haunting comes from 1962. The tape begins with a series of beeps, then a voice, male, whispering numbers and coordinates in Russian. The voice grows weaker, panicked. He says, "We are losing pressure." Then, "Tell my family I love them." A high-pitched tone follows, then static. It's chilling because it sounds too real. No music, no dramatization, just the raw, terrified voice of someone trapped in a place where no human had ever been before. And then there's the detail that keeps theorists up at night. At the end of one of those tapes, you can hear faint breathing, just before the feed cuts out. Not silence, breathing. Years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, some documents did surface showing several cosmonaut candidates who were part of early failed tests. Some names were real, some were redacted. There were reports of suborbital flights that ended in crash landings, capsules that burned up or were never recovered. But none matched the dates, so we're left with this uncomfortable gap between truth and myth. Maybe the Giudica Cordiglia brothers misunderstood what they heard. Or maybe, just maybe, they stumbled on transmissions they were never supposed to hear. Because think about it. If you're the first country to send humans into space but the first ones don't make it back, do you announce it to the world or do you erase them? It's easy to imagine their capsules still drifting up there, silent tombs orbiting forever above us, reminders of a race that sacrificed its nameless pioneers for glory. But even creepier? Some radio operators today claim that on rare nights when the solar winds are calm and the static fades, you can still pick up faint signals from the old Soviet bands. Whispers, pulses, a heartbeat that shouldn't be there. Maybe it's just interference, maybe it's something else. But if you tune carefully, you might just hear what the world was never meant to know, the ghosts of the first travelers who reached the stars. History doesn't always move in revolutions or wars. Sometimes it shifts quietly, in bank vaults behind closed doors, in ink on paper that decides who wins and who starves. And no family understood that power better than the Rothschilds. For 2 centuries, their name has been a whisper attached to wealth, secrecy, and influence so deep it's hard to tell where fact ends and myth begins. But to understand the shadow they cast, we need to go back, not to palaces or battlefields, but to a cramped building in Frankfurt, Germany, sometime around the late 1700s. Inside, a man named Meyer Amschel Rothschild ran a small coin-dealing business. He was clever, patient, and obsessed with connections. When he realized that information was worth more than gold, he started building a network that spanned the great powers of Europe. He had 5 sons, and instead of keeping them close, he scattered them like chess pieces across the continent, each one stationed in a different capital: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. 5 brothers, 5 banks, all bound by blood, loyalty, and coded letters written in their own secret shorthand. They weren't just bankers. They were invisible diplomats, funding kings, financing wars, and quietly influencing borders. During the Napoleonic Wars, when Europe was drowning in chaos, the Rothschild network thrived. Their couriers travelled faster than armies, carrying news before anyone else had it. There's a story, maybe true, maybe not, that Nathan Rothschild, based in London, received news of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo a full day before the British government. He used that advantage to buy government bonds when everyone else thought Britain had lost, and when victory was announced, the market exploded. Overnight, his fortune multiplied, and with it, the myth of the Rothschilds as puppet masters of Europe was born. But here's where it gets interesting. Unlike monarchs or politicians, the Rothschilds didn't rule from thrones. They ruled through debt. They realized that whoever controls the flow of money doesn't need to control the people directly. If you can decide who gets funded and who doesn't, you can steer nations without ever firing a shot. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild banks were involved in almost everything: the construction of railways, the financing of empires, even the founding of Israel's early economic structures a century later. But for every verifiable achievement, there's a shadow behind it, whispers of manipulation, secret deals, and an unseen hand guiding history. For example, during the 19th century, revolutions spread through Europe like wildfire. Governments fell, monarchies crumbled, and yet, somehow, Rothschild investments almost always survived. They were never on the losing side for long. That's not luck. That's leverage. And that leverage made people uneasy. Cartoons from the era portrayed them as spider-like figures weaving webs over the globe. Pamphlets accused them of funding both sides of wars to profit from the chaos. It was propaganda, sure, but every myth starts with a truth that makes people uncomfortable. Then the 20th century arrived, and the world changed. New financial powers rose: Wall Street, the Federal Reserve, the IMF. The Rothschilds stepped out of the spotlight, but their influence didn't vanish. It evolved. They diversified into wine, mining, energy, banking, each branch fragmented into new families, new trusts, new partnerships, so complex that no one can say who really controls what anymore. And that's where the modern theory begins, because the Rothschilds are no longer a family, they're a system. Their descendants sit on boards, own foundations. Power doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a suit, a security badge, or a polite smile in front of a camera. And behind that smile, something else decides what really happens. People call it the deep state, a phrase that sounds like something from a thriller, but it didn't start that way. It began as a quiet idea that somewhere beneath the visible government we vote for, there's another layer. Not elected, not temporary, but permanent. A system of intelligence agencies, defense contractors, bureaucrats, and global interests so intertwined that even presidents can't fully control them. And the strangest part? Every country seems to have one. The modern concept started in Turkey during the 1990s. They called it derin devlet, the deep state. It referred to a secret alliance between the military, organized crime, and intelligence services working behind the scenes to protect the nation, even if it meant manipulating democracy itself. Assassinations, blackmail, coups, all justified in the name of national security. But that idea didn't stay in Turkey for long. Soon, researchers began applying it to the United States, especially after the JFK assassination, Watergate, and the Iran-Contra affair. Moments where the official story didn't quite fit. You see, the deep state isn't one group. It's a structure. Think of it like a spider web, a dense network of people and organizations who all share one goal: continuity of power, regardless of who's sitting in the Oval Office. That's the key. Presidents change, cabinets rotate. But the machinery underneath, the CIA, NSA, Pentagon, the contractors, the lobbies, the banking networks, they don't. They persist. They adapt. They wait. Take the 1950s and 60s, the golden age of Cold War secrecy. The CIA overthrows governments in Iran and Guatemala. The FBI spies on civil rights leaders. Corporations fund both sides of political debates. And somehow, the names of the people who authorize these moves rarely appear in textbooks. That's where the idea of a hidden hand began to feel real. Journalists like Carl Bernstein wrote about how intelligence agencies infiltrated newsrooms. Over 400 American journalists had allegedly worked with or for the CIA during the Cold War. Even Hollywood wasn't untouched. Scripts were adjusted, plots rewritten, funding approved or denied based on what message the government wanted to send. So when people talk about a deep state, they're not always talking about a secret cabal in a dark room. Sometimes it's just inertia, a system that's too big to stop, even when the people in charge want to. But every theory has its spark, the moment it stops being abstract. For America, that moment came in 1963 when President Kennedy was assassinated. Officially, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Unofficially? Documents declassified decades later revealed a maze of coincidences. Oswald's connections to intelligence circles, mysterious disappearances of evidence, witnesses dying in car crashes. Too many loose ends. Too many people who knew too much. The story became less about who shot JFK and more about who could silence a president. That's when the term deep state found its cultural footing, as the invisible network powerful enough to override democracy itself. Fast forward to the 21st century. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the rise of mass surveillance, whistleblowers like Edward Snowden exposing global monitoring systems that even Congress didn't know existed. The deep state suddenly didn't sound so crazy. We learned that intelligence agencies collect billions of data points daily. Private defense companies operate with budgets larger than most countries. Elected officials come and go, but the contracts stay. And when politicians, from both sides, tried to pull the plug, somehow the machinery always found a way to keep running. It's not a cabal anymore. It's a self-sustaining organism, one that feeds on secrecy, thrives on chaos, and grows stronger with every crisis. The strange part is how normalized it's become. Movies joke about it, news cycles mention it in passing. But deep down, everyone knows. Some decisions aren't made in public. You can feel it, that sense that no matter how loud the protests or how big the elections, something always stays the same. That's the feeling of the deep state. Not evil, not good, just unaccountable. There's a theory that the deep state isn't even hiding. It's in plain sight. The agencies, the contractors, the revolving doors between corporations and government. It doesn't need to conspire when the system itself protects it. It's like a black hole. You don't see it directly, but you see what it does, the distortion around it. And that distortion shows up everywhere. Wars that never end, surveillance programs that never shut down, and secrets that are always classified, just long enough to be forgotten. So maybe deep state isn't the right word. Maybe it's something older. Maybe it's the natural evolution of empire, where the power to decide who lives, who dies, and what the truth is, no longer belongs to the public. Next, we'll step out of politics and into something older. Something buried not in archives, but in stone. Because centuries before governments learned to hide their power, there were whispers of an order that already had. A group so secretive, their symbols still appear on our money, architecture, and even in the world's most powerful institutions. The Freemasons, the original architects of secrecy. If power in the modern world moves through money and bureaucracy, power in the past moved through ritual, symbols, and whispered agreements. And no organization embodies that better than the Freemasons. We often picture them as old men in aprons, meeting in dimly lit lodges, trading handshakes and secrets that no outsider could understand. But the reality is deeper, older, and far more influential than most people realize. The roots of Freemasonry stretch back to the medieval stonemasons' guilds in Europe. Not just builders of walls and cathedrals, but holders of knowledge, geometry, engineering, mathematics. Skills so specialized that apprentices swore oaths never to reveal them. Those oaths weren't just about craft. They were about trust, loyalty, and secrecy. Over time, these lodges began admitting non-masons, philosophers, scholars, merchants, people interested in the ideas, not the stone. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Freemasonry evolved into a fraternal organization that combined ritual, morality, and a subtle network of influence. And that's where it starts to get interesting. Freemasons weren't just meeting to discuss geometry or ethics. They were creating a network, a system where loyalty and secrecy could transcend geography, religion, and politics. A member in Paris could call on a brother in London, Vienna, or Philadelphia, and trust that the connection was real. And in a time when kings and emperors controlled borders with armies, such a network was powerful. That network didn't stay abstract. It influenced revolutions. Some of the most prominent figures in the American Revolution, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, were Freemasons. The French Revolution too had secretive Masonic connections, though historians debate the extent. The key wasn't that Freemasons orchestrated history. It was that they had the infrastructure to act silently. Then there's the symbolism. Masonic symbols are everywhere. Compasses, squares, pyramids, eyes that see all. Some appear in architecture, some in documents, and yes, even on the US dollar bill. It's easy to dismiss these as decorative, but symbols were historically more than art. They were markers, messages, and warnings to those who knew how to read them. This is where speculation takes over. Some claim the Freemasons were laying the groundwork for modern secret societies, including those behind financial systems, intelligence networks, and global alliances. Others argue that such interpretations exaggerate a fraternity's influence. But here's the thing, the infrastructure was real, the network was there, the knowledge was there, and secrecy was baked into the system. Consider this. Throughout history, Freemasonry survived wars, persecutions, and political upheaval. Kings banned them, churches condemned them, governments infiltrated them. Yet the lodges endured, quietly adapting, always retaining their core principles: loyalty, secrecy, and the cultivation of influence. Which raises a question: Why did so many revolutionaries, industrialists and leaders feel compelled to join? Not for power alone. There were plenty of avenues for that. They joined because it offered access. Access to information, access to networks, access to people who could change the course of history quietly. By the 19th century, Freemasonry had spread worldwide. Europe, the Americas, Asia, lodges everywhere. And with them came influence over emerging institutions, universities, banks, courts, and even political parties. This is where the line between history and myth blurs. Stories of Masonic rituals, secret handshakes, and hidden signs spark the imagination. But if you strip away the theatrics, the real mystery is practical. How did an organization survive for centuries while remaining so influential and so secretive? That question echoes today. We see echoes of it in global organizations, think tanks, and even the networks we discussed earlier, the Rothschild financial empire, the deep state. The Freemasons were, in a sense, the original architects of secrecy, creating a system where influence could survive independently of individuals or governments. And maybe that's why people still whisper about them. Not because they control everything, but because they invented the blueprint for influence and secrecy. A blueprint that modern power structures still rely on, consciously or not. The story of the Freemasons reminds us that secrecy and influence aren't always about villains in dark rooms. They're about systems that outlast wars, revolutions, and generations. And when you trace that system forward, you start to see how it connects, subtly, invisibly, to modern conspiracies. Next, we move from the lodges and symbols into something far newer. Something born in the digital age, a space where secrecy meets technology, and influence spreads faster than any king, banker, or secret society could have imagined, the shadow internet and modern surveillance networks. If the Freemasons built the blueprint for secrecy in the physical world, the internet built it in the digital one. Except this one doesn't have lodges, aprons, or secret handshakes. It has servers, protocols, and a nearly invisible web of networks that track, store, and analyze almost everything we do. Welcome to the shadow internet. Most people think the internet is open, that what you type, click, or post is under your control. But in reality, there's a hidden layer, invisible to search engines and browsers. Some call it the deep web, not to be confused with the dark web, which is the criminalized fringe. The deep web is massive. The NSA reportedly stores yottabytes of data from every device connected to the network. Emails, metadata, location history, transaction logs, information that can map your life in excruciating detail. And that's just the beginning. After September 11th, governments around the world invested heavily in mass surveillance programs. America's PRISM, Britain's Tempora, and similar initiatives were designed to intercept communications, track digital footprints, and even predict behavior. Algorithms analyze your habits, what you buy, what you watch, even how long you pause a video. Every click is a data point, every search a breadcrumb. Some of it is defensive, stopping attacks, identifying threats. Some of it is predictive, shaping policies, influencing elections, or controlling narratives without anyone realizing it. And the scary part? The people who run these systems aren't elected. They are engineers, analysts, and contractors, permanent entities in a network that never sleeps. Sound familiar? The shadow internet isn't just government-run. Private corporations maintain enormous influence too. Google, Meta, Amazon, companies that control the platforms we depend on every day, hold more data than most countries' intelligence agencies. Advertising, social media, even online banking creates a permanent digital footprint, feeding predictive algorithms and behavioral analytics. In other words, power isn't just political anymore, it's informational, and those who control the information can subtly shape reality. Consider the 2010s, a decade of digital revolutions. Social media wasn't just a way to connect, it became a tool for psychological operations. Micro-targeted ads, content algorithms, and viral campaigns could influence behavior at scale. Studies later showed that online manipulation could sway elections, encourage social unrest, or reinforce ideological bubbles. It's not conspiracy fiction, it's documented fact. The same networks designed to keep us connected also create control structures hidden behind convenience and entertainment. But even beyond social media, there's a layer most people never see. Tor networks, VPNs, and encrypted messaging apps hide activity from casual observation, yet they're monitored by more than a few entities. Whistleblowers like Edward Snowden revealed that even encrypted services can be targeted, metadata collected, and users profiled. It's a silent system, one that learns more about you than even your closest friend might know. And the implications are staggering. Governments, corporations, and intelligence agencies can now track movements in real time, analyze behavioral patterns to predict decisions, influence what people see online without their knowledge, all while remaining mostly invisible. The shadow internet mirrors older secret systems, like the Freemasons, the Rothschilds, or the Deep State. It's not a single organization. It's a network effect, a permanent structure of control built into the very fabric of society, evolving faster than oversight or regulation can keep up with. And here's the unnerving part. Because it's digital, it can't be escaped. Even if you leave social media, unplug your devices, or go off-grid, your habits, preferences, and history may already exist somewhere, indexed and accessible. It's a modern-age panopticon, silent, omnipresent, persistent. Which brings us to an important thought. Power in the modern world no longer relies solely on force, money, or secrecy. It relies on data. And those who understand the shadow internet can influence entire populations without ever revealing themselves, much like the secret societies and financial networks of the past. So, if the Freemasons taught us how to hide influence physically, and the Deep State taught us how to institutionalize it, the shadow internet shows us how to hide influence digitally, invisibly, permanently, and just like the mysteries before it, the Dyatlov Pass, the Philadelphia experiment, even the lost cosmonauts, there's always something lurking just beyond our vision, waiting for the wrong click, the wrong signal, the wrong curiosity. We've walked through secret societies, vanished cosmonauts, and the invisible power of the shadow internet. All of those were, in some way, about control of information, of history, of perception. But there's one last layer, and it's arguably the most unnerving, hidden technology. The things whispered about in obscure corners of the web, filed away in classified labs, or buried in footnotes of declassified documents. Because if information is power, technology is godlike power. And the gap between what we're told exists and what might actually exist is wide enough to drive an entire conspiracy through. For decades, governments and militaries have been working on technologies that sound like science fiction. Directed energy weapons that can disable electronics or even affect the human nervous system. Hypersonic crafts capable of speeds and maneuvers that defy known physics. Stealth drones so small and so quiet they could fit into the palm of your hand and disappear into a crowd. Most of these projects are classified, hidden behind acronyms, budgets, and vague language like research into non-lethal systems. We only catch glimpses, a leaked patent, a blurry test video, a whistleblower's claim, and every glimpse feels like we're staring at a puzzle with missing pieces. Take, for instance, the active denial system, a real US military project that uses millimeter-wave beams to cause an intense burning sensation on the skin. It was tested as a crowd control device. Officially, it's non-lethal. Unofficially, it's a proof of concept for a weapon that could control, disperse, or incapacitate masses without firing a single bullet. Or look at the silent aircraft patents filed in the mid-2000s, designs that use electromagnetic fields to drastically reduce noise signatures. Combine that with drone technology, and you have vehicles that could fly over cities completely unnoticed. How much of this tech is already deployed? We don't know, and that's the point. Then there's the matter of unacknowledged programs, projects so compartmentalized that even people working on them don't know the full scope. Think about the Manhattan Project during World War II. Tens of thousands of people worked on it, yet only a handful knew they were building an atomic bomb. That was the 1940s. Imagine what could be hidden now in an age of AI, quantum computing, and nanotechnology. Some theorists believe this hidden tech isn't just about weapons, it's about rewriting reality itself. Things like advanced psychological operations, synthetic media indistinguishable from reality, or even mass behavioral manipulation through digital signals. It sounds paranoid, until you remember that we already have deepfakes, predictive algorithms, and behavioral nudges built into social media. If that's the public-facing version, what's the classified one? And then there's the topic most governments won't touch openly: propulsion and energy breakthroughs. Over the last few years, multiple patents from defense contractors and the US Navy describe things like hybrid aerospace underwater craft and high-energy electromagnetic field generators. They read like Star Trek specs, crafts that could move through air and water seamlessly, powered by field effects that sound suspiciously like anti-gravity. Officially, these are just patents, nothing more. Unofficially, some insiders claim prototypes exist, which leads to the inevitable question: if such craft exist, who's flying them? And for what purpose? When you combine secret weapons, advanced surveillance, and potential breakthroughs in propulsion or energy, you don't just get a stronger military. You get the ability to shape societies, to suppress, mislead, or even control populations on a scale never before possible. It's not hard to imagine why these things would be hidden. Technology like that isn't just power, it's destiny-shaping power. And yet, these things leak. Every decade or so, a piece of classified technology becomes public. Radar, stealth aircraft, the internet itself. All started as secret military projects before filtering down to civilian life. So, when we look at UFO reports, mysterious patents, or unexplained energy weapons, maybe we're not seeing aliens or time travelers. Maybe we're just glimpsing our own future, decades ahead of schedule, hidden behind the classified curtain. This is why hidden technology is the capstone of all the conspiracies we've talked about. The Philadelphia experiment, alleged time travel, the lost cosmonauts, hidden space disasters, phantom time, rewriting history, the shadow internet, controlling information. All of them point to the same truth. When power is hidden, it can experiment without consequence. And so, as we close in on the end of this journey, we're left with a final thought. If all of these threads, secret societies, hidden histories, surveillance networks, and unknown, so where does it all lead? We've walked through the snow and ice of Dyatlov Pass, stared at the void of lost cosmonauts, traced the invisible hands of banking dynasties, slipped behind the curtain of the deep state, wandered through the lodges of the Freemasons, and finally into the digital shadows of the internet and hidden technologies. Each story by itself is strange, each seems improbable, but when you start to look at them together, when you trace the patterns, a subtle, unnerving shape begins to emerge. It's a pattern of hidden power, not always violent, not always intentional, but persistent. Because here's the thing, secrets are the oldest tool humanity has. They've shaped history more than wars or treaties ever could. They hide in mountains, vaults, lodges, servers, and laboratories. They survive chaos, regime changes, even revolutions. And the more things change, the more they remain the same. Think about it. 9 hikers fleeing into a snowstorm, panicked by forces they didn't understand. Early astronauts lost to silence, their stories buried under layers of political necessity. Bankers and secret societies building influence so slowly and carefully that it becomes almost invisible. Governments operating in shadows, networks of information and surveillance so vast that the public only sees a fraction, and technology evolving faster than any oversight can contain, quietly reshaping our world before we even notice. Individually, they're mysteries, but collectively, they're a blueprint for how influence survives, for how power persists, for how control, subtle, unseen, and often benevolent or malignant, flows through human systems in ways most people never consider. And that's why conspiracies endure. Not because every whisper is true, not because every secret plot exists, but because secrecy itself is real. We might never know everything. Some threads are forever lost, buried in frost, erased from records, encrypted or classified. Some questions will never have answers, because the people who could answer them either disappeared, lied, or were sworn to silence. And yet, the feeling remains. that the world isn't entirely as it seems, that even today, just beyond our vision, hidden forces shape events, guide outcomes, and manipulate narratives. And maybe that's the point. Perhaps the universe, human society really, thrives on these hidden structures. They keep the engine running, they maintain continuity, they preserve knowledge, power, and sometimes chaos. But there's hope in the mystery too, because while these systems are hidden, they're not infallible. History shows us that secrets leak, truths escape, patterns emerge, and if you pay attention, if you follow the breadcrumbs, notice the inconsistencies, listen to whispers behind the headlines, you can glimpse the machinery beneath the surface. You can see the threads connecting Dyatlov Pass to lost cosmonauts, Rothschild networks, secret societies, the deep state, and the shadowy corners of the modern digital age. Threads that remind you that the world is far larger and far stranger than it seems. So the next time you feel like you're just living your life, scrolling online, walking through a city, watching news stories unfold, remember, every decision, every signal, every shadow has layers, some obvious, some invisible. And behind those layers, there's always a story of survival, secrecy, and human ambition, a story of forces that shape our past, our present, and maybe even our future. That's why mysteries endure, not because they terrify us, not because they promise answers, but because they remind us that we are not the center of the universe. We are observers, we are participants, and sometimes we are the puzzle pieces, unknowingly moved by the hands of history, technology, and power that never stop. So, look closer, listen carefully, and remember, the world is never quite what it seems, because the threads of the hidden world are always there, quietly weaving the story you're living. And sometimes, if you pay attention, you can catch a glimpse of the pattern before it disappears again.